Hello family, welcome to Stories by Tocci. We bring you interesting folk tales. Please subscribe and drop a like for us. This generosity would go a long way for us. Also share to family and friends. And please turn on post notification to stay tuned for more. Thank you as you do so. Now let's get into the story. The night Daniel walked out of the small bungalow in Riverbend, the rain in Abaddon fell as if the clouds had swallowed pepper and couldn't stop coughing it back to earth. And the porch light made a stubborn halo around Nora's tired face, while Eli burned against her chest like a little coal that wouldn't dim. She watched the taillights glide away, two red eyes retreating into the wet dark. And the paper he'd left on the kitchen table lay there like a lizard in church, shameless and still. Don't call me unless it's about the boy. And even the kettle seemed to understand what had happened because it kept its tongue. The phone line was already cut, the rent already late, and the fridge hummed like a mosquito nagging at her last nerve. But deep inside, where most people keep their panic close like money sewn into a hem, she felt a small room open, quiet as the Ajacuta River at dawn, not empty but waiting. She thought of Lagos traffic, loud and impatient, the way Daniel entered every room, like a Danfo bus blaring horn and swallowing space. And she thought of Port Harcourt mist, soft and stubborn, the way she moved around furniture without asking it to move for her. And she remembered the first time she had held Eli and named him with a breath that felt like prayer. And now the prayer was walking out into the night with a man who loved his reflection more than his promises. The roof had its own bad habit, one drip that came when storms had bones, and she put a pot under it, tin, singing in a slow language, while she pressed her cheek to Eli's hot crown and counted the beats of his breath like beads on a rosary. And the floorboards talked back to her feet as if they had been waiting to speak their mind. And even the clock had attitude, ticking noisy like it wanted to be heard more than obeyed. Riverbend itself was the kind of place where news could outrun wind on a Kaduna highway, where everybody knew how your story would end before your second act began. And yet the river that gave the town its lazy name did not hurry or explain itself. It simply folded around stones and carried on, which is a kind of courage some people never learn. The rain slowed until it was more whisper than speech. And when she blew out the lamp, the darkness sat down with her like an old Annie who had come to keep vigil. And in that darkness, with Eli's breath easing and the drip moving from scold to lullaby, she let herself imagine a road that did not require his footsteps, a house that did not pull its dignity from his voice, a season where the roof would be patched and the ledger would not look like a field of dry harmattan grass. She told herself, softly, the way a mother tells a baby a truth that will not break his heart, that morning is stubborn, that it always comes with its basket of small mercies, and when it comes she would answer it with both hands open, because whatever else the night had said, it had also said this: a closed door can make a house finally. Listen. In the pale stretch of morning that followed, when Enugu's sky wore a washed-out blue, and the clothesline trembled like a guitar string in a restless song, Nora folded yesterday into a corner and set water to boil as carefully as a woman hiding savings beneath floorboards. Because waste has many cousins, and all of them live at home. Aunt May arrived with shoulders like a mango tree and a voice full of road dust, placing a loaf wrapped in a dish towel on the table the way a bishop sets a Bible. No rush and no doubt, then sat as though the chair had been waiting for her bones, looked at the child, looked at the ceiling, looked at Nora, and said in that steady Abaddon mouth, "Call him, my dear. He thinks you can't breathe without his coins," which was a simple sentence wearing heavy shoes. Nora wanted to answer that air doesn't ask for permission to enter a lung, that light doesn't knock before it steps through a window, but she dialed anyway on a neighbor's phone that smelled faintly of crayfish and palm oil, left a message in a voice that did not tremble, and the next day a transfer arrived like a stingy guest. 15,000 naira with a note that read "Be smart," and she understood at once that in his dictionary, smart meant counting on him as a fool's errand. She walked to the river at evening when Riverbend's gossip was yawning and the goats were writing their own scripture in dust, and she watched the water carry a brown leaf past a cluster of stubborn stones, the current refusing to argue with the obstacles because it had better things to do, and she thought, if water can mind its business and still make a road, then so can I, and she wiped Eli's small mouth with the corner of her wrapper when he squeaked a hungry syllable, tasting the iron memory of fever in his sweat and promising, quietly as a hat tip, never to trade her child's peace for another person's pride. The house, which had once puffed itself up to hold his temper, now exhaled like a bellows. Set down after a long night, and every object, spoons, curtains, broom, seemed to decide that they could serve a different king, the kind who pays with patience instead of noise. By the time the kettle sighed itself into silence, Nora had arranged her thoughts like dishes on a rack. The first plate was the truth that survival is not a speech but a series of small chores. The second was the vow that her ledger would sing a new song. The third was her secret knowledge that pride does not feed a child but clarity can plant yams, and she tucked Eli into sleep with a hum learned in childhood during long rides between Kaduna and Zaria, when dusk came early and the road wore its tired face. And the hum worked still, because some songs do not ask you to grow up before they keep you. The days that followed moved like an old bicycle, creaky, serviceable, asking for oil and getting none, while Nora learned to count the town by sounds instead of signs. The bread seller's horn at 6, the neighbor's radio arguing politics at 8, the market's throat clearing around 9, the mailman's knock like a polite accusation at noon. She kept a ledger the way a river keeps memory, page by page, line by line, each naira bent into usefulness, as if it were wire being shaped into a basket. She sold a silver bracelet to Mr. Gibb, trading shine for supper and not blinking while doing it, because hunger has a sharp tongue, and she had heard it speak before. Then she mended Sada's hem, babysat Mrs. Ojo's twins, two little comets who believed the floor would catch them even when the floor had other plans, and swept for Ms. Dottie, who ran the linen stall with the precision of a military parade in Abuja. The evenings belonged to cloth and thread and quiet calculation, scissor size and needle whispers, while the pot above the leak beat slow time and Eli breathed a small song. And when her finger pricked and a dot of blood bubbled, she watched it calm itself like Port Harcourt rain passing a stubborn sun, and smiled because small pain is honest and requires no translation. She paid in attention what she could not pay in ease, listening to customers at the market, how their hands paused at bars of pine soap, because a scent can jump a person back 20 years to a kitchen inn. Enugu, how mothers asked for trousers with knees that could kneel to scrub and then rise again without apology, how basket sellers ran out of small sizes because corners demand order before rooms do. At night, when the generator in the next compound coughed itself into reluctant life, she drew on brown paper with a borrowed pencil, a soft geometry of survival, measuring twice and cutting once. And the seams grew straight not by magic but by practice, and the soap learned the language of her stirring, oil and lye becoming something kind under her spoon, lemon peel and mint leaf turning the basin into a small forest where hands could rest after long work. She began to understand that the roof's drip was a teacher, not a torment, calling her to fix what could be fixed with time, and to put a pot under what couldn't. And in that understanding her fear stopped pacing like a restless landlord, and sat down like a visitor willing to wait its turn. It was Aunt May who first said, with the certainty of someone who has buried both pride and people, that a slow path is still a path, and Nora kept that sentence folded beside her coins as she prepared a table for the market with the neatness of a bride preparing a new bed, laying out aprons, tiny trousers, and soaps tied with twine, each price written in pencil beside the goods like a polite introduction. The sun in Riverbend rose with the laziness of a cat, and still managed to find every crack, and customers began to come, not like a flood but like a patient rain. A painter from Lagos with flecks of color on her forearms who turned Nora's stitching over and nodded like a judge tasting oji. A man who pressed a lemon bar to his nose and smiled the way men smile when they remember being sons. A mother who measured pocket size with her whole hand and said, "Make it swallow plenty things," and paid without bargaining as if she were blessing a church. The landlord, when she paid in cash, lifted an eyebrow so high it could have waved at birds, and she did not explain her arithmetic to him or to anyone else because a pot does not justify its soup to the hungry. That night Daniel's message arrived like a fly at a feast. "You good? Need me to send something?" And she deleted it with the same care she used to tie knots at the end of thread, not out of spite but out of a new respect for silence. The storm that blew through 2 evenings later stitched lightning across the sky like a tailor in a hurry, and the roof kept its old habit, but the drip felt less like scorn and more like a reminder that some things wait their turn and still get done. When Eli woke and reached for her cheek with sleepy fingers, she understood, as clear as noon in Kaduna, that she would stitch this life into shape with the same stubborn patience water uses to make a way, and that the town could keep its rumors like old clothes if it wanted, because she had clothes of her own to make, and names to give them, and coins to count in a ledger that finally sounded like a future. The second month began with mornings that were cool enough for breath to float like little ghosts, and the sun arriving shyly over Riverbend's low roofs, as if it didn't want to wake anyone too quickly. Nora had learned by then to fold the day into measured pockets. First the boiling of water for Pap, then the feeding of Eli while he made small impatient sounds in his throat, then the setting aside of coins from the day before into a jar she kept under the loose floorboard near the wardrobe. That jar was a small promise, though it didn't yet know what it was promising. She moved through rooms like someone memorizing a map, mentally marking the corners where damp liked to hide, the patches of floor that swallowed sound, the windows that needed to be opened in a certain order to let the wind pass through. Her steps were quieter now, not because she was afraid to disturb anyone, but because she was beginning to understand the rhythm of her own work. The market was still her anchor, though she could only afford a place there on certain days. On others, she walked its aisles as a customer, noting the way people lingered, the stalls that drew attention without shouting, the sellers whose goods sold before noon, and the ones whose faces grew more desperate as the afternoon thinned. She noticed that no matter how many stalls there was always space for something useful and well-made. In those quiet observations, a small strategy began to take root in her mind, like seeds scattered by accident and only later finding soil. Eli was growing heavier in her arms, his head turning towards sound now, his fingers clutching fabric with intent. He had begun to respond to her voice with small bursts of laughter that startled her each time, because she could feel in them the possibility of joy even in lean days. The roof still leaked in its favorite spot, but she had stopped seeing it as an insult. It was just a part of the house's language, one she could answer later when there was more in the jar. In the evenings, when work was done and Riverbend's air tasted faintly of wood smoke and roasted corn, she would sit by the door, Eli on her lap, and watch shadows move like dancers across the opposite wall. She didn't always think about Daniel then. Sometimes she thought about nothing at all, and that nothing was more restful than she had imagined possible. There was a steadiness in her now, though she didn't name it, like a rope pulled tight between two trees. It simply held her upright. The path to self-sufficiency in Riverbend was not a straight road, but a twisting one, full of small detours and unplanned lessons, and Nora discovered that her survival depended on noticing these detours without resenting them. She found herself mending clothes for neighbors more often, sometimes for pay, sometimes for food, once for a stack of firewood that lasted her almost 2 weeks. In return, she learned that goodwill was its own currency, one that could be saved and spent just as carefully as coins. The children she watched for Mrs. Ojo began to greet her in the street, their voices carrying over from the next block, and she began to see her own name in people's mouths more often, not in gossip, but in that practical way of recommending someone's skill. The ledger she kept was now less of a list of debts and more a catalog of progress. Though the margins were still narrow, she recorded not just earnings, but also the things she had learned. How to set a hem so it wouldn't pucker, how to boil soap until it turned the right shade of cream, how to stretch a handful of beans into a meal that lasted 2 days. She started experimenting with patterns for aprons that had wider straps and deeper pockets, noticing that these were the ones customers asked for more often. On market days, she carried her goods in a cloth bundle tied to her back, Eli snug in his sling, and she took time arranging them on her small table, so that the best stitched seams faced forward. She had stopped worrying about whether other sellers were watching her. Instead, she watched them, learning the rhythm of their sales, the way they called customers without sounding desperate. There was a stall 3 rows down run by a man from Enugu who sold woven mats, and she noticed that he never raised his voice, yet always sold out by midday. One afternoon she asked him why, and he smiled in a way that suggested the answer was obvious. People trust quiet work. She carried that phrase home with her, tasting it like sugar cane, and decided that this would be the spine of her own business. Not shouting, not chasing, but making things worth approaching. It was during one of her walks to the market, on a day when she could not afford a stall but wanted to see what others were selling, that she came across a woman boiling something fragrant in a shallow pan over a charcoal fire. The woman was old, with hands that shook slightly, but moved with a confidence that made the shaking irrelevant. Nora stopped to ask, and the woman told her it was soap scented with lemongrass, the leaves crushed and boiled with the lye until the whole mixture carried the smell of rain on grass. They spoke for a while, and Nora left with a small sample tucked into her pocket. That night she washed Eli's cloth with it, and found that the scent lingered long after the fabric had dried. She added lemongrass to her list in the ledger. The next week, she found herself buying a small bundle of leaves from a boy who gathered them by the riverbank, paying in coins so light she almost felt guilty. She spent the evening boiling, stirring, and watching the mixture change under her hand. When she cut the bars the next day, She felt the same quiet pride she'd felt when Eli first sat without help. A small milestone, but one that pointed to more. On her next market day, she brought the lemongrass soap alongside her usual pine and lemon. By noon, every bar was gone. A woman from Port Harcourt bought 3 at once, telling her it reminded her of her mother's washing days, when the whole yard smelled clean before noon. Nora listened closely to this, realizing that scent was not just a luxury, it was memory made solid. She began to think of how she could weave more memory into her goods, how each item could carry not just use but a story. Her table at the market was becoming less a place for selling and more a place for quiet exchanges, and this suited her. She left each day not with wealth, but with a growing certainty that the jar under the floorboard would not stay light forever. Evenings in Riverbend during that second month were gentler, and Nora began to use them not just for work, but for planning. She would sit with her ledger open on the low table, Eli asleep beside her, and trace the numbers with her finger, as though feeling their texture might make them grow. She had started setting small goals, buying enough cloth for a week's worth of sewing without having to depend on scraps, learning how to cut patterns faster without losing neatness, saving for a proper tablecloth that would make her market stall look more inviting. Some nights she sketched designs she could not yet afford to make, aprons with embroidered hems, or soap wrapped in paper stamped with her own mark. She did not yet know how she would get the paper or the stamp, but she allowed herself the indulgence of the drawing. The quiet of those nights was unlike the silence after Daniel had left. This was a chosen quiet, one she filled with the sound of pencil scratching and the occasional sigh of satisfaction when a line fell exactly where she wanted it. Outside, the streets settled into their own rhythm. Distant laughter, a door closing, the faint rattle of a bicycle passing on the uneven road. She began to sleep more soundly, not because her troubles were gone, but because she had begun to build something sturdy enough to hold them without collapsing. The jar under the floorboard had a bit more weight to it now, enough that when she lifted it, it pressed against her palm in a way that made her think of possibility. She did not count the money every day. Instead, she counted the steps she had taken to put it there, knowing that each step was worth as much as the coins themselves. The third month crept in like a polite guest, unannounced but already seated, and Nora noticed it in the way the mornings no longer felt as heavy on her shoulders as they once did. The air was still cool, but it carried a freshness that made her open the windows before the kettle began to murmur. She had finally saved enough to rent a small table at the market for more than 1 day a week, and that change alone seemed to push her forward, like a current under a boat that had been stuck too long near the shore. On the first morning of this new routine, she wrapped her goods in clean fabric, the bundle neat enough to pass for a gift, and stepped into Riverbend streets with Eli strapped securely to her back, his warm weight a familiar anchor. The market was already alive, sellers arranging their displays like painters preparing a canvas, buyers drifting through with the alertness of hunters, and the hum of bargaining rising like steam from a pot. She chose a corner near a vendor who sold pepper and dried fish, knowing the scent would draw people close. Unfolding her tablecloth felt like the start of something larger than she could yet see. She laid out aprons, children's trousers, and her soaps in tidy rows, adjusting each until the table looked like a small promise kept. The first customer that day was a man from Calabar who worked in the transport yard. He picked up an apron, turned it over in his rough hands, and nodded once before paying without a word. Soon after, a mother stopped with her little girl and bought soap, explaining that the scent of lemon reminded her of her grandmother's kitchen in Owerri. Each sale was not just a transaction, but a thread in a growing web of connections, and Nora began to feel that her work was no longer just survival. It was starting to belong to the fabric of Riverbend itself. By the end of that first week, she had sold enough to pay the rent without touching the jar under the floorboard, and that jar began to feel less like an emergency measure and more like a seed buried deep, waiting for the right season to break the surface. Her place in the market was small, but she treated it as though it were the front room of a home she wanted visitors to remember. Every morning she swept the area around it before laying out her goods, and she kept a folded cloth in her bag to wipe away the dust that drifted in from the unpaved road. She found that customers noticed small acts of care, the neatness of her stitching, the way each bar of soap was tied with even loops of twine, the clean smell of the fabric on display. One afternoon, an elderly woman from Kaduna stopped by and bought an apron, then returned the next day with her daughter, who bought 2 more. The woman told her, "Good work calls its own witnesses," and Nora carried that sentence with her for the rest of the week. She began to see how her goods were finding their own way into homes and kitchens, how they would be handled and worn by people she might never meet. It gave her a quiet satisfaction to imagine an apron she made hanging in someone's kitchen in Kano, or soap she cut being used to wash clothes beside a river she had never seen. She also learned that the market was as much about listening as it was about selling. Customers spoke without meaning to, revealing what they valued, what they lacked, and what they would return for. She overheard a woman telling another that most aprons tore too easily at the straps, so Nora began to reinforce hers with extra stitching, sacrificing a little time for the sake of strength. She paid attention to the questions people asked: whether the trousers would shrink, whether the soap would last in storage, whether the aprons could be washed without losing their color, and she answered each with the calm certainty of someone who stood behind her work. By doing this, she built something more valuable than a single day's profit: trust. And trust, she realized, was a currency that could outlast coins, because it made customers return without being called. The rhythm of the market began to settle into her bones, each day offering its own small challenges and quiet victories. She became familiar with the other sellers, greeting them not just as neighbors in trade, but as fellow travelers on roads that often bent under the same weight. The pepper seller told her about seasons when the river flooded, and the market had to move uphill for weeks at a time. The fish seller explained how to smoke fish, so it could survive a month without spoiling. She stored these bits of knowledge the way she stored spare fabric, knowing they might be needed one day. On one particularly busy afternoon, a sudden downpour scattered customers and sent sellers scrambling to protect their goods. Nora moved quickly, wrapping her items in the market cloth and sheltering them under the table until the rain eased. When the sun returned, she saw that while some stalls had lost stock to the water, hers had stayed dry. That evening, as she walked home, she thought about how storms in Riverbend could arrive with little warning, but preparation could keep the damage from breaking you entirely. This lesson sat quietly beside her as she cooked yam porridge for herself and Eli, feeding him small spoonfuls while he laughed at the sound of the rainwater dripping from the roof's edge. The laughter reminded her that while money and goods could be lost, the will to start again was something no storm could wash away. In that way, she saw herself in the market, weathered but standing, a fixture people could rely on to be there tomorrow. By the end of the third month, Nora's earnings were enough to let her imagine things she had not dared to before. She thought of buying a small mirror for the stall so customers could see themselves wearing her aprons, or saving for a second table where she could display more goods without crowding them. She thought about making a sign with her name on it, not painted loud and bright, but carved in wood so it would last. These were not dreams of luxury, but of stability, and they filled her evenings with a different kind of work: planning. She sat with her ledger and ran her fingers over the lines of numbers, not just to count them, but to feel the shape of her progress. Eli had started crawling now, moving across the floor with a determined wobble that made her laugh, and she saw in him the same persistence she was learning to claim for herself. When she lay down at night, she thought not of what she lacked, but of what she was building, piece by piece, like a house whose foundation was finally strong enough to bear weight. And in those thoughts, she felt something shift, a certainty that whatever lay ahead, she was no longer waiting for help to arrive. She was already on the road, and each day's work was another step forward, steady and sure, no matter how far the journey might yet be. Daniel's presence in Riverbend was never quiet, even when he wasn't speaking. He had the sort of energy that traveled ahead of him like a messenger, alerting people before he even stepped into a space. Lately, that presence had started to gather in corners Nora couldn't quite avoid. Bell's, the low-roof beer parlor near the main road, was one such place. It had wide, open windows that spilled the smell of stale drink and roasted meat into the street, along with the bursts of laughter that followed Daniel's booming voice. He'd lean against the counter, shirt pressed to the point of stiffness, shoes glinting even in dusty light, spinning stories that weren't quite lies but weren't quite truths either. He knew how to bend words so they landed softly in the ears of those who wanted entertainment, and he did it with an ease that kept them listening. The talk was always about his burdens, the sacrifices he'd made, the woman who had drifted too far from reality while raising his child. He never mentioned the child's smile, the smell of soap from Nora's hands, or the fact that Eli had learned to sit without tumbling. To the men in Bell's, Daniel was a figure in a story of his own making, a man betrayed by life's unfair turns, a man who carried the weight of responsibility alone. Nora passed Bell's often, not because she wanted to but because the road to the market curved right in front of it. She learned to keep her gaze steady, to let her eyes rest on the dusty stretch ahead rather than on the heads that might turn toward her. Still, the air around that place had a way of pressing itself against her as she walked by, and sometimes she caught the shift in conversation, the pause before voices rose again, as though her passing had nudged the story back into motion. It was a night of still air when she discovered the stroller. She had been bringing in the last of the day's work, fabric folded into a basket, soap wrapped in brown paper, when she noticed the stroller sitting at the far end of the porch, angled in a way she didn't remember leaving it. The light from the street lamp fell across it in a pale arc, revealing two clean, deliberate slashes across the tires. She froze, not from fear but from the quiet clarity of knowing this had been done with purpose. Eli, warm against her shoulder, reached toward a moth circling the lamp, his small fingers opening and closing in fascination. The softness of that moment, the way his world was lit by small, fluttering wings, made the damage seem both petty and dangerous at once. She crouched to run her fingers along the cuts. The rubber felt cold, the edges neat. There was no note, no sign of who had done it, but the message didn't need words. It was the kind of act that was meant to remind her she could be reached, even in her quiet spaces. She carried Eli inside, bolting the door with a slow turn, listening to the click echo faintly in the small room. That night, she lay awake longer than she intended, not with the kind of fear that keeps the body rigid, but with the awareness that her steps were being measured by someone else's shadow. The thought didn't slow her pulse, it sharpened it, turning over in her mind how best to build around such intrusions without letting them set the shape of her days. The market had its own ways of carrying undercurrents, and sometimes they swirled closer than she liked. One late morning, while she was setting her table, straightening the neat stacks of aprons, the rows of soap wrapped in twine, a man she didn't recognize lingered near her stall. He picked up a bar of soap, turning it over slowly, his eyes on her rather than on the thing in his hand. There was a faint smile on his face, one that didn't quite reach his eyes, and when he spoke, it was with the tone of someone who already knew the answer to the question he asked. "You make all of this yourself?" She answered simply, keeping her movement steady, her voice neither warm nor cold. He set the soap down without buying anything, giving the table one last glance before walking away. The exchange lasted less than a minute, but it left a trace that followed her through the rest of the day, a thin thread of unease weaving itself into the rhythm of selling and greeting. She didn't tell Aunt May, not because she wanted to keep it hidden, but because it didn't yet feel like something that could be named without making it heavier. By the time the sun had tilted westward, the tension had thinned, replaced by the steady work of counting coins and wrapping goods for customers she knew by name. Yet when she closed her stall that day, she made a small adjustment, arranging her goods so that she could stand slightly behind them, with a clearer view of the path that led to her table. It was a quiet shift, the kind that no one else would notice, but it was one more thread in the net she was weaving to hold her ground. That evening, Aunt May arrived with a cloth-wrapped bundle, setting it down on the table without a word. Inside was an old cardboard shoe box, the lid secured with a strip of fabric tied in a loose knot. "I think you'll want this," she said, her voice carrying that measured tone she used when something was meant to be absorbed slowly. Nora untied the knot, the fabric falling away to reveal papers, receipts yellowed at the edges, folded notes, slips that bore the handwriting she recognized as Daniel's. Some were from years back, payments missed, purchases made when there was no room for them, promises scribbled in haste. She sifted through them, each one a small tile in a larger mosaic of how their lives had tilted and slid over time. Aunt May stood nearby, her arms crossed loosely, not rushing the silence. The papers felt dry against her fingertips, but they carried weight all the same, a weight not of paper but of memory, of things that had been lived and survived. She gathered them into a stack, setting them back into the box, the knot tied once more before she slid it beneath the table. The air between them didn't need filling. It was enough to sit in the shared understanding that sometimes the past is best kept close until the right moment to open it comes. The first draft of court letters had been sent, and the days that followed felt like the deep inhale before a storm announces itself. Riverbend moved with its usual rhythms, but Nora began to notice the finer notes, the things she might have ignored in busier months. She observed the market with a keener eye, not as a place where she only sold aprons and soap, but as a web of transactions, alliances, and unspoken agreements. The yam seller on the corner gave the best price in the first hour after sunrise. The cloth dealer from Kaduna never haggled past the third counteroffer, and the pepper woman 2 stalls away kept her best stock hidden until she decided who deserved it. This was a kind of education, the learning of currents beneath the surface. Eli, now more mobile, required eyes on him even in the smallest of rooms, his crawling deliberate as if he were mapping the world in his head. Nora balanced her work around his movements, moving the soap cutting board higher, keeping the sewing needles in a tin only she could open. She found herself waking earlier, before the first rooster's ragged call, to stir soap mixtures or cut fabric in peace. The jar beneath the floorboard began to carry a weight she could feel in her wrist when she lifted it, the coins clinking like an argument that had finally learned to be constructive. Aunt May visited often, bringing with her both food and silence when needed, sitting beside Nora with the air of someone willing to wait through any length of time. There were still moments when doubt tried to enter, especially when whispers passed too close or when Daniel's shadow threatened to spill into her mind. But these moments had less power now. The presence of Ms. Carrington's letters in her drawer acted as a counterweight. Their careful folds seemed to anchor the air itself. She had not told many people about the lawyer, and she liked it that way. Sometimes the most powerful moves were the ones that grew roots before anyone saw their leaves. Nora had learned the patience of waiting without idleness, the discipline of using each day before the appointed day arrived. Ms. Carrington had explained that Daniel would be served papers soon, and that there would be a hearing after the court returned from a short recess. The weeks until then could have been wasted in nervousness, but Nora refused to let them drift empty. She threw herself into refining her goods, adding new designs to the aprons, crossback straps that didn't pull at the neck, side pockets sewn so they wouldn't sag after washing. She experimented with a soap that blended pine and lemongrass, the 2 scents twisting together like a conversation that both sides wanted to keep going. At the market, she presented these small innovations as casually as she could, not wanting to appear like someone scrambling for favor, but rather someone whose work naturally evolved. The reception was warm, and she took note of the way regular customers lingered longer at her table now, not just buying but asking after Eli, commenting on her fabrics, even suggesting colors they'd like to see. This steady interaction built more than sales. It built a circle of witness, people who could, without prompting, attest to the constancy of her work and her care for her child. This was not lost on Nora. She understood that, in disputes, the truth was often measured not only in documents but in the impressions held by those who observed you daily. In the quiet of evening, she stitched and thought about this, about how Daniel's version of her was a shadow puppet, flat, without depth, easily torn. The life she was building, however, had dimensions, texture, and weight. When she closed her eyes, she could almost see the courtroom not as an ambush, but as a stage where her truth could stand without trembling. The strength in that image was new to her, but she welcomed it, pressing it into her memory like a pressed flower between pages. The first sign that Daniel had received the papers came not from him directly, but from the sudden dip in the market's background noise, as though conversations briefly remembered they had teeth. A man who often drank with Daniel passed her stall, his glance lingering too long on her table before sliding away without greeting. That same day, the landlord greeted her with uncharacteristic brevity, his usual lingering comments absent. The air in Riverbend has a way of carrying messages without words, and this air told her that something had been delivered and read. She expected Daniel to confront her, perhaps to send a message or appear at her door, but instead he disappeared from sight, a tactic she recognized from his earlier games. When cornered, he withdrew, letting others speculate on his behalf. This retreat did not unsettle her as it once might have. Instead, it gave her room to breathe, to move without his interruptions. She noticed that the market's regulars continued to visit her, and that in the absence of Daniel's voice, some of the rumors began to thin, their repetition losing force without fresh fuel. Still, she remained careful, keeping her records up to date, making copies of receipts, and writing brief notes of each day's earnings and sales. She sent none of this to Ms. Carrington yet. The lawyer had told her that organization was a form of readiness, and Nora had come to appreciate readiness as a kind of shield. At home, Eli had begun pulling himself to stand, holding onto the edge of the table and beaming at his own achievement. She clapped for him each time, not because she doubted he would do it again, but because each small victory deserved to be acknowledged before the next challenge arrived. The days edged toward the hearing date with a mix of normalcy and low hums of anticipation. Nora continued her work with a deliberate calm, knowing that the routine itself was part of her preparation. She took no bait from indirect remarks, and she avoided any place where she might be drawn into a scene that could later be twisted. When she passed Belle's, she kept her head high, neither seeking nor avoiding the eyes she felt on her. At the market, she began to pack her goods in a slightly larger cloth, a small acknowledgement that her production had grown, that she was moving from survival into something steadier. She also began to think beyond the court case, about what she wanted to build in the months that would follow, regardless of the outcome. These thoughts were not grand or abstract. They were as practical as adding a second line of stitching to a strap. She thought of building a small shelf at home to store finished goods, of acquiring a sturdier table for the market, of maybe, just maybe, buying a chair with a backrest to ease the hours of sewing. Such thoughts gave her a sense of continuity, a reminder that her life was not a pause between Daniel's actions, but a river with its own course. On the evening before the final week leading to the hearing, she sat by the window, Eli asleep in the crook of her arm, and watched the lanterns in the street sway in the wind. The air smelled faintly of rain, and the distant sound of someone pounding yam reached her through the quiet. She realized, in that moment, that she was no longer measuring herself against what Daniel had taken or threatened to take. She was measuring herself against the woman she had been when he left, and finding that she had not only held her ground, but had built new ground to stand on. The courthouse in Enugu had the kind of old paint that seemed to have absorbed the weight of every argument and plea it had ever overheard, and on the morning of the hearing Nora walked its front steps with a calm that was not born of ease but of preparation. The air was thick with the early heat, yet her mind felt cool, her thoughts arranged as neatly as the goods on her market table. Eli was with Aunt May, who had insisted on keeping him away from the long wait and heavy talk. In his absence, Nora felt lighter, but also keenly aware of the space where his small warmth usually rested against her. She wore a dress she had sewn herself, every seam straight, the fabric chosen for its quiet dignity rather than any loud declaration. Inside, the corridor smelled faintly of dust and paper, and the hum of voices echoed off the walls in a low, restless chorus. Daniel was already there, leaning against the wall as though it were a prop meant to hold up his version of events. He was dressed sharply, a pressed shirt and shoes polished enough to reflect light, his eyes sweeping over her once with an expression that tried to blend pity and superiority, but landed somewhere between performance and unease. Miss Carrington greeted Nora with a nod, her presence compact and steady, her folder held close as if the contents inside were a lockbox of measured truths. When their case was called, they entered the courtroom where the judge sat with the air of a man who had heard every possible version of human disappointment and no longer found novelty in any of it. Daniel began speaking first, his words arranged like dominoes meant to fall in sequence. How he had been the sole consistent provider, how Nora's projects were distractions from the needs of the child, how he feared for Eli's stability in a home built on small earnings. He spoke with a rhythm meant to sound reasonable, glancing occasionally at the judge as if expecting approval. Nora listened without interruption, her face composed not in indifference but in readiness, her hands folded lightly in her lap. She knew the time for her truth was coming, and when it did, it would not need to be loud, it would simply need to stand. When Ms. Carrington began, her tone was level, each sentence placed with the precision of a seamstress cutting cloth she could not afford to waste. She started with the ledger, pages dated and signed, showing earnings and expenses over months, each figure anchored by receipts that matched. She spoke of the market stall, the consistent production of goods, the network of customers who returned regularly. She moved next to the matter of child care, explaining the measures Nora had taken to ensure Eli's safety while she worked, the neighbors who could attest to seeing him well-fed, well-clothed, and happy. Then she addressed Daniel's claim of financial burden, presenting the receipts and notes from the shoe box, tavern bills, the layaway slip, the casual threats written in his own hand. Each document was placed before the judge without flourish, the paper speaking in its own blunt language. Finally, she unfolded the property deed, laying out the details of the mortgaged river cottage, the missed payments, and the deliberate attempt to conceal an asset while pleading poverty. The effect was quiet but complete, a slow unraveling of Daniel's narrative until it lay in loose threads that could not be gathered again. Nora felt no surge of triumph in that moment, only a deep settling in her chest, as though a weight she had carried without naming was finally being set down on a surface sturdy enough to hold it. Daniel's eyes flickered, his earlier composure shifting into something less certain, his glances toward the judge no longer fishing for agreement, but searching for a foothold. Miss Carrington closed her folder with the certainty of someone who knew that the truth, once properly laid out, needed no further embroidery. The judge sat back, hands steepled, and let the silence draw out, as if giving space for the air in the room to adjust to what had been laid before it. When the judge spoke, his voice carried the flat weight of authority, without malice or sympathy, only the deliberateness of law. He acknowledged the evidence as clear, the records as consistent, and the concealment of property as an act that weakened Daniel's credibility. He ordered regular child support payments in an amount proportionate to Daniel's actual means, set a schedule for arrears to be paid, and issued a warning against any interference in Nora's business or attempts to disrupt her stability. He did not entertain Daniel's protests beyond a brief reminder that the court's interest was the welfare of the child, not the vindication of either parent's pride. Nora listened, each word falling into place like bricks in a wall she had been building unknowingly over the past months. When it was done, and the formalities concluded, she rose with Ms. Carrington, thanked the judge with a nod, and left the courtroom without looking back. Outside, the sunlight felt sharper than it had when she arrived, as though the day itself had been scrubbed clean. Daniel emerged moments later, his stride quicker, his face set in a mask that tried to hide the lines newly drawn there. He passed her without a word, the air between them filled not with the tension of an unfinished fight, but with the quiet understanding that this chapter had closed in a way he had not chosen. Nora walked down the courthouse steps at a steady pace, each one echoing in her ears as a reminder that she had not simply survived the months leading here, she had met them on her own terms. The road back to Riverbend seemed longer that afternoon, not because of weariness, but because Nora allowed herself to take it slowly, letting the familiar sights pass like pages in a book she knew well, but had never fully read. She stopped at the market on the edge of town, where the yam seller was packing up for the day, and bought 2 small tubers with coins she carried loose in her pocket. At another stall, she picked up bruised mangoes at a discount, imagining Eli's sticky fingers and the way he would laugh when the juice ran down his chin. The sellers greeted her as they always did, their voices warm and without the hesitation she had felt in previous weeks. The undercurrent of rumor that had once made her skin prickle seemed to have thinned, replaced by something closer to recognition. When she reached home, Aunt May was on the porch, Eli asleep in her arms, his head resting against her shoulder, as if no part of the day could disturb the rest he had found there. Inside, the small house felt different, no larger, no newer, but steadier, as if the walls themselves had listened to the verdict and decided they could hold themselves upright without strain. That evening, as she bathed Eli and wrapped him in a clean cloth, she thought not of courtrooms or judgments, but of the quiet work waiting for her tomorrow. Soap to cut, cloth to stitch, customers to greet. These were the constants, the threads she could weave into whatever came next. And as night settled over Riverbend, she sat by the window with her ledger open, not to count coins, but to write a single line that seemed to contain the weight of everything she had lived through. We are standing. The words looked small on the page, but they carried the kind of truth that needed no ornament. No matter who tries to write your story for you, remember you hold the pen. People may doubt you, twist your truth, or hope to see you fail, but steady hands, honest work, and patience will always outlast noise. Protect your peace, guard your progress, and never let anyone convince you that you are powerless. May your hands never lack honest work, may your table never lack food, and may your heart never lack peace. May those who speak against you be silenced by the evidence of your growth, and may doors open for you before you even knock. May your efforts multiply like seeds in good soil, and may your life be a testimony that light always wins over darkness. You will rise above every scheme, your joy will be full, and your name will be called blessed. Amen. Hope you enjoyed this interesting story. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Turn on post notifications. See you on our next story.